This podcast includes graphic material of sexual assault and murder. Viewer discretion is advised.
The Indigenous people of Canada are known as the Mi'kmaq from the Maritimes, the Cree from the Saskatchewan area, and the Inuit from the Northwest Territories and Nunavut area. Despite Canada's helpful and friendly representation across the earth, our government and society have been, in a word, terrible to the Indigenous people. When the Europeans began to colonize the North Americas, most of the Indigenous people of the time were very accepting to the white newcomers. Most of the Europeans, however, had their own agenda and used the Indigenous kindness against them by manipulating them into signing treaties the Indigenous couldn't read. These treaties often signed away most of their land away to the Europeans. During the time of the slave trade, some Europeans would sell some of the Indigenous as slaves to other countries, mainly to France. Most of the Indigenous in Canada were killed by new diseases the Europeans brought with them. Some of the infection was purposely spread through contaminated gifts of clothing or blankets to the many communities of Indigenous. As many Indigenous people were forced to give up more of their life and land to the European government, trauma and dysfunction began to spread amongst families in Indigenous communities who were unable to cope with the Europeans, treating them less and less like human beings through racist laws, such as refusing to give electricity to Indigenous communities, refusing clean water, and spreading misleading and discriminative ideologies to white children in schools. Indigenous people were seen as second-class citizens, and as a result of this, were rarely given support by the Canadian government, causing the wounded communities to become even more unstable. Many Indigenous families had a hard time coping with the Canadian government system and racial bullying, and some members of the Indigenous communities found they could not support themselves and their families. This sometimes led to alcoholism, domestic abuse, and suicide for members of the Indigenous communities. I want to make it clear that there were plenty of Indigenous families and people who did not turn to violence or abuse and remained somewhat healthy and capable of taking care of their children. The Canadian government saw an opportunity to rid the white part of Canada from the Indigenous and their culture, and decided the best way to kill the Indigenous culture was to brainwash the children of their native culture and educate them on the European culture. This is where the phrase, "kill the Indian and the child," was created. One politician from Ministry of Indian Affairs writes in 1920, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, the other country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada who has not been absorbed into a body of politic, and there is no Indian question, and no Indian department, in this whole object of this bill." Residential schools were first introduced by French missionaries in the 1620s. These schools were, in theory, supposed to assimilate the Indigenous culture, essentially brainwashing Indigenous children with European beliefs. These schools were more voluntary to the Indigenous families at the time, causing no one to send their children, and these premature residential schools were destroyed. Hundreds of years later, in 1883, the first government-funded residential schools started. The difference between these schools and the French missionary ones were that these were mandatory for Indigenous children to attend, and it would be considered illegal for parents to stop their children from going to these specific schools. Indigenous kids would literally be dragged from their homes and families and forced into trucks, government cars, or trains. After being taken from their communities, Indigenous children were then taken to schools that could be hundreds of kilometers away from their original homes or provinces. Most of these schools were run by Roman Catholic churches, with a few schools being run by Christians and Protestants. When the terrified children first arrived at these residential schools, nuns would force children into bathtubs and attempt to clean the children with soap and bleach, which would obviously burn the children's skin. This was done in an attempt to clean and make them whiter. Children's hair was also to be cut short, and to suppress the children's background, it was preferred by the church to cut them at a very short length. Children were forced to speak English in these schools and were punished severely if the children spoke any of their native language known as Cree. This was particularly hard for some of the students, as some children did not know how to speak English and only knew Cree, and found it even harder to communicate in a whole new language, let alone read and write in a new language too. This would easily kill most of the indigenous culture, as most of their beliefs and celebrations were told orally and not written down, as the indigenous people of Canada communicated mainly by talking and drawing to express themselves and their culture. If the children were brainwashed and could not remember their culture, it would be hard for them to retrieve knowledge back without talking to family members whom they rarely saw. From the article, Why Were Residential Schools Created in Canada? By Paradigm Shift. Some survivors of these schools recounted their horrible childhood memories. Quote, even in these letters to the family, they forced them to write English. George Gearing, a First Nation resident and survivor, mentions, Sister Marie Baptiste had a supply of sticks as long and as thick as pool cues. When she heard me speaking my language, she'd lift up her hands and bring down the stick on me. I've still got bumps and scars on my hands. I have to wear special gloves because the cold weather really hurts my hands. I tried very hard not to cry when I was being beaten, and I can still just turn off my feelings. And I'm lucky. Many of the men my age, they either didn't make it, committed suicide, or died violent deaths, or alcohol got to them. And it wasn't just my generation. My grandmother, who was in her late 90s, to this day, it's too painful for her to talk about what happened to her at these schools. Another victim shared, as a result of the fear, I used to wet my bed almost every night in the first year, and a nun used to rub my face in my own urine. I cried more, I cried louder, and then she threatened me more so. I went to bed hurting more, physically and emotionally and mentally. Boys and girls were kept completely separate, not even allowing siblings to interact. End quote. Girls were taught the main basics of their education of writing and math, while also learning basic household duties such as washing dishes, sewing, and cleaning. Boys learned stereotypical roles of woodworking and athletics. The nuns and teachers brainwashed the children into thinking their indigenous heritage and culture was uncivilized and sinful, ingraining the racist ideologies the government and Catholic Church had towards the indigenous people. Children were forced to speak English and were often poorly taught basic math skills, writing, and taught many of the Catholic verses via praying and reading the Bible verses. Some schools would allow children to go home for the summer to see their parents and family. However, other schools would keep children away from their parents all year round. Many parents would try to find their missing children, but neither the school's officials or government would disclose to parents where their children were being held. Like I said before, sometimes children were being held nearby or could be in a completely different province or area, making it extremely hard for parents to find their beloved children. Due to being taken at sometimes very young ages and being unable to leave the schools at all until they were in their late teens, children would often forget their parents, and when they were finally released into society, they were unable to find any family or community to support them. Other children who were very badly brainwashed from the racist ideologies of the school found they wanted nothing to do with their parents and saw them as uncivilized or sinful, and would refuse to engage with their family. Many children died due to the unsanitary conditions at these crowded schools, and graveyards were often built instead of playgrounds for the small bodies. It was rare for a school to ever disclose the death of a child to parents, and would often sweep the deaths under the rug. From the article by Paradigm, through this, money was generated and used to fund the schools because of the federal funds were always low in quantity. The quality of lifestyles was extremely poor. Overcrowded rooms, substandard hygienic conditions, malnutrition, and poverty-stricken health facilities, due to which fatal disease most commonly. The Spanish flu, tuberculosis, influenza, measles, smallpox, etc. were conceived by them, brought about the demise of uncountable children in these schools. In 1907, Government Medical Inspector P.H. Bryce disclosed that 24% of previously healthy Indigenous kids across Canada were dying in residential schools. As per the TRC report, 3,200 students have died due to overcrowding. Even in some schools, there were instances of forced sterilization of the girls, as well to terminate the generational expansion of the Indigenous communities. End quote. Unsurprisingly, many kids killed themselves while in these schools to escape the horrendous treatment they were experiencing, which included violent beatings, sexual abuse from other students or staff, or the overall emotional trauma of being separated from their parents. Some children chose to try and run away from schools, but were either recaptured or died during the process. Very few runaway children actually made it home to their parents, who were usually thousands of miles away. One particularly famous story about this situation was the story of Cheney Wenjack, a 12-year-old Indigenous boy who suffered from sexual, physical, and emotional abuse at Chilika Jeffrey Indian Residential School. One day, he managed to escape the school with 2 other students. These 2 students made it home and gave Cheney a few matches before he continued his long walk home, which was about 400 miles away. Poor Cheney had never made it home to his loving family. Cheney died on his walk, due likely to the frigid cold and starvation, and his body was never found. The Canadian government also tested drugs on residential school students, which often made the children very sick and uncomfortable. From the article, Residential Schools Subjected Students to Disease, Abuse, and Experiments by Lisa Young, Global News, students at various residential schools were used as involuntary guinea pigs in a variety of experiments, notably a number of studies on nutrition. Students were given more or less milk. Some of them were given vitamin C tablets, and others were not. Some were given vitamin-enriched flour, and others were not. The intent was to determine whether these dietary interventions cut the indice of various diseases, but the control group students were never given the chance to share any benefits. In some cases, children were denied access to dental care or iron supplements. They were also used as research subjects without their parents' consent. End quote. End quote. A eerie fact about the survival rate of residential schools goes like this. In World War II, 1 in every 26 Canadian soldiers was going to die from the war. In residential schools, 1 in every 25 students was going to die from the school due to abuse, suicide, murder, starvation, or disease. Yes, that's how fucking bad it was. God. Developing girls were told to be ashamed of their bodies and were often forced to bind their chests and make them look flat. If children spoke up against officials or attempted to protect their dignity or their siblings, they were punished by cruel methods of starvation, beatings by fists, sticks, belts, Bibles, and boxing gloves. One school in Saskatoon, Canada, had its own homemade electric chair, which was often used on students to torture them. Residential schools were known for their rampant sexual abuse, and children were often abused by staff and sometimes other students. This happened repeatedly throughout their entire childhoods. Depending on the school, most children were taught from grade 1 to 12, making children live at the school for around 7 to 13 years. However, despite the long period of time children were in these facilities, many students were only taught to a grade 6 levels of education, causing many students to be unable to find a steady career or decent job to support themselves and their future families. Despite the government claiming to only want to help the children succeed in their education, career, and to find a place in society, the residential schools failed miserably accomplishing the basic tasks it claimed it was supposed to be doing. Almost every single child who survived these schools were emotionally, mentally, and sometimes physically scarred from the ordeals, causing them to deal with their trauma in unhealthy ways through drug addiction, drinking, domestic abuse, and suicide. The last residential school closed in 1995, which was located in Saskatchewan, Canada. In the past 10 years, our Canadian government has apologized for its cultural genocide of the Indigenous people, but the Catholic Church representatives in Canada refuse to acknowledge the atrocities, let alone apologize for their role in the residential schools. From the article, Residential Schools Subjected Students to Disease, Abuse, and Experiments by Lisa Young, Global News, again, the issues, which was vigorously tamed down time and time again, raised its head once more when hundreds of unmarked graves were found at 5 provincial sites of the previous residential schools. On the 28th of May, 2021, 250 unmarked graves of children were identified at the site of Kamloops Indian Residential School. Later, this was followed by 104 unnamed graves at Brandon Indian Residential School on the 4th, June 2021. 751 unmarked graves at Matreeville Indian Residential School on the 24th of June 2021. This continued on with 182 unnamed young graves on the 30th of June 2021, and this followed with 182 unknown graves at Cooper Island Indian Residential School, with excavations further ordered at other residential sites. Many Indigenous communities still suffer from dirty drinking water and unreliable electricity to this day. In Nunavut, major grocery stores sell their food at ridiculous prices due to shipping costs. One jug of milk is $30 in Canadian in the Nunavut area. No wonder most of the Nunavut population hunts for their food. Many Indigenous communities suffer from economic problems and social issues of racism, lack of jobs, and addiction. Indigenous women are much more likely to be murdered or abused, as the Canadian government tends to ignore cases of missing Indigenous people more than cases of missing white women or men. In the 80s, a prolific serial killer named Robert Pickton murdered multiple sex workers in British Columbia, Canada. Many of these women were Indigenous, and due to their heritage, multiple police officers ignored the large number of missing women, which were later discovered to be murdered by Pickton. Some police officers did a little work because they had troubling connections to Willie Pickton and his sketchy Piggy's Palace establishment, where many sex workers would be invited to perform and would sometimes never return. At some point, I will cover this case, as it's an important outlook into the criminal justice system of Canada. Canada still has a long way to go to make up for their cultural genocide of the Indigenous people. Thankfully, we have started teaching public school students about the Mi'kmaq culture in the residential schools, making a new generation aware of the country's prior atrocities. However, this can depend on the school's curriculum. Since the internet has blown up, survivors of residential schools are now able to tell others what they went through and how the government-funded schools have caused them and their families to go through so much pain and suffering. I encourage people to read more about Canada's residential schools online, or to listen to survivor stories and what they have to say. I also highly recommend the Secret Path book about Cheney Wenjack's story and how he died a lonely death simply looking for his family. A book has been written by Jeff Lemire and the tragically hit member Gord Downey. Gord Downey was extremely passionate about Cheney's story and wanted to represent it in the best way he could. There is a short film version of the book, The Secret Path, on YouTube, and I will leave a link to it in my description. To remember the people who have been murdered, Indigenous people and their supporters have created the symbol of an orange shirt for remembrance of the child victims of residential schools. A similar symbol was done with the red dress to symbolize the missing and murdered Indigenous women who were easily kidnapped and murdered in Canada. After the Indigenous children's graves were discovered, there have been a small number of Catholic church burnings that happen to be close to Indigenous communities. Some people believe these burnings were done by frustrated members of the public trying to erect some sort of revenge against the Catholic churches of Canada that still refuse to accept their involvement in residential schools. There are a few conspiracy theories floating around on YouTube and TikTok, wondering if church officials are burning down their own churches to hide records of missing Indigenous children, while framing nearby Indigenous communities as the culprits for the fires. None of this has been proven to be true. However, these accusations do hold some merit, as many of the residential school officials are still alive, and likely want to erase any of their involvement in the atrocities committed. Indigenous people are slowly starting to grow a voice in Canada, with the help of the decent human beings of the public and their own resilience. However, Canada's government and some of Canada's prejudiced public have a long, long way to go.